go down to the woods today, you're in for a big surprise. The sun is low in the sky, darkness lays across the land, and now is the time for storytelling. Join me in the woods for a short story, one that makes your spine tingle and brings those goosebumps out on the backs of your neck. This story is called A Slip in Time, and it's not really a story of action, more of atmosphere. As we live our mundane lives day to day, what do we miss? What things pass by our attention unnoticed? After all, as Hamlet once said, there are more things on heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. I hope you enjoy. So, it's a dark, foggy day in November. I'm down in the woods and I'm going to share a story with you. I have lots of little animal friends that have come to listen as well, so I hope you enjoy it. It's called A Slip in Time. My eyes opened and I was staring at a black ceiling. Somewhere in my mind's eye I could see the remains of what I had been dreaming. For a minute I was dazed, as images of a school and an unexpected test tried to recapture my attention, but then I suddenly realised I could hear that sound again, and it was not in my dream. Damn, I sat up. Not again. The sound of church bells ringing into the night had awoken me on every night for the past week. I looked over at my digital clock. Slowly the blurred red numbers came into view. 2:41 a.m. What kind of time was that? Last night it was 3:15 a.m. and the night before it was 4:53 a.m. I sat up and listened. Surely it was just some kind of timer on the bells that was running out of battery or something. I can't imagine anybody actually physically meeting up for a bell ringing meeting in the middle of the night, and at such strange times. Unless, of course, it's some kind of witch's cult. But then, why would they be meeting in a church? No, clearly it's just my imagination running wild. Not being fully conscious and being all alone in a new house, in the middle of nowhere. Not that I minded the solitude, but I didn't expect the nights to be so dark and the old cottage to be so creaky. It was only tiny, with one room upstairs, one down, and a kitchen extended onto the front. You could hear the wind whipping around its stone walls, making the house feel like it was a ship creaking on the water. After only a week of living here, I dreamed almost every night that I was on the ocean, and I could hear people's voices calling me on the wind. I shivered, pulled my blanket up over my shoulders, and walked over to the window. Pulling the curtain aside, the small window tucked into the grey stone walls looked out onto blackness. There were no stars tonight, but I could make out the skeletal fingers of a tree, slowly moving backwards and forwards like fingers, trying to get into my window. An owl screeched. Somewhere another one replied. The bells continued to ring. They seemed to be coming from directly behind the cottage. Beyond what I knew were trees. I had no idea where the church was. I didn't know the area at all. I'd been going through a difficult time in my life, and my friend had offered me a holiday cottage, just for a bit of time out. I crawled back over to the bed and got inside, pulling the blanket over my head. The church bells continued to ring. Then they fell silent quite suddenly, and I wondered if I'd dreamed of them after all. The next morning was damp and misty, but somewhere over the pale February horizon, a glimmer of sunlight was trying to peek through. I pulled my bright pink hunter wellies on, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and donned a very big warm overcoat that made me look like a mushroom with my spindly legs sticking out of the bottom. Today, I was going to go in search of the mystery church and its bells. Google Maps didn't show any church in the vicinity, except the one up in the town, and I had already asked there the locals, and they had told me that their church bells were currently out of order. So I locked the little green front door and headed round the back of the house into the woods beyond and away from the road. The sun was beginning to break through the mist, making the cobwebs glimmer, and my boots made squelchy noises on the damp grass. It was dark in the trees. The sunlight did not permeate the tops of the boughs. Nevertheless, the ground was clear and easy to negotiate, because the time of year meant the undergrowth had died right back. I must have walked for a good long way before I grew tired and sat down with the flask I had brought with me, and checked my phone. It was still showing trees ahead, but the circle in the centre was spiralling. Lost signal. The screen went white. I was just beginning to think about giving up when I heard them. It was the bells. I stood up and strained my ears towards the sound. The ringing was incredibly close. The damp air muffled the sound slightly, like the sound of your mobile ringing from inside your pocket. It was then that I realised there was a signpost standing by a ghostly white birch tree, whose empty, cascading, mossy branches partially concealed it from view. It was wooden and very old-looking. One arm pointed to Ashton, 1/4 mile. The arm facing back behind me said Upton, 5 mile. There was also what appeared to be a footpath, though I had certainly not spotted it before. I continued on in the direction of Ashton, the air steadily getting thicker and duller as I walked. The mist was closing back in again. I could feel the cold and the droplets of rain on my chest as I took deep breaths. Still, I continued on as the path was well trodden. The mist had turned into fog now. I could barely see beyond the path in any direction. Occasional branches and wisps of ivy brushed by my hair, and sometimes water would splash down onto my head if I brushed too hard. Still, just as I was wondering whether to continue on my way, the mist suddenly began to clear as quickly as it had started, and the shafts of golden sunlight once again began to penetrate through the swirls of water droplets. Then I was out in the open altogether, the sun shining, standing by a stone cottage, much like my own, and looking down the high street of a quaint little hamlet. This must be Ashton, I said to myself aloud. Sure enough, a little church that only seemed to be one room with a small belfry stood ahead of me, and its bell tower was ringing brightly. The sun was reflecting off the one small stained glass window, and a carpet of snowdrops flowered on the green in front of the entrance. All in all, it was very pleasant, and the ringing had stopped. There didn't seem to be anyone about, although a few of the chimneys round about were smoking. There were about 5 cottages, scattered here and there along the dirt road, and in each garden there seemed to be winter vegetables growing, although far and few between at this time of year. I wandered down the track, a bit rutted and muddy in places, which probably explained the lack of vehicles. It really was a secluded old hamlet, probably hundreds of years old. A light was flickering in one of the windows, and I could faintly hear some music. It sounded like jazz. Despite the sunshine being bright, the time was moving on, and it was very low in the sky. It was casting deep shadows along the street. Just then, there was a squeak and a bang, and an elderly gentleman was coming out of the church door. He turned and locked it behind him and walked down the steps. By the time he had reached the bottom, I was waiting for him. "Hello," I said. "You best be getting along, lass, it's not safe," he grumbled when he caught sight of me. "It will be dark very soon." "Oh yes," I replied, slightly confused, but then I suppose I was alone in the middle of nowhere with no phone signal. "I was just wondering if you could tell me why you keep ringing the church bells at all hours of the night." "The church bells?" he replied. "Yes, it just doesn't seem to follow a pattern, and I just wondered why." "Well, it's like them old jerrys. Any time of the day or night. You can't be too careful. You never know. Now you best get back home off with you, lass, before it is dark. And with that, he bumbled off round the church and out of sight. I heard another door bang, and by the time I had made to see where he had gone, there was no sign of him. I went back around to the cottage with the light. The music was still playing. Through a tiny crack in the curtain, I could see what looked like an old-fashioned oil lamp burning on the windowsill. It was getting dark, and quickly now. After wandering around the hamlet a little while more, and still no sign of anyone else to talk to, I decided to call it a day. I had no idea what the elderly chap had been on about, but then he was probably making fun of me. I can only imagine that whatever the true reason was for the ringing of the church bells, he wasn't going to solve the mystery so easily for me. But at least I knew there was a church, and that I wasn't going crazy. I found my way back to the footpath, but the fog was dropping in again quickly. Luckily, it didn't take me long before I came back by the old sign, facing behind me to Ashton and ahead to Upton. This time I determined to follow the path in the hope I could find my way out of the woods more quickly than I had taken to get into them. I had probably been wandering around in circles before stumbling across the old sign in the first place. My cottage was 4 miles from Upton, so I couldn't have too far to walk. Once the signpost had passed out of sight, which wasn't long, the fog began to lift again. I found myself stepping out of the road just above my cottage. I hadn't seen this gap in the hedge before, and half hidden in the ivy was a broken signpost with a rotting arm pointing to Ashton that you'd only be able to decipher had you known where it was pointing. That night, I lay awake, listening for the sound of the church bells. But there was only silence. The local store was one of those that did everything. Fuel, groceries, they even had a bakery. Today was my last day at the cottage, and I was actually excited to be going home and sorting my life out. I had decided to call in at the store for some fresh supplies for the road. "You're the girl that was asking about church bells the other day," said the good-natured looking chap behind the counter. I didn't like to say anything, being as you were staying all alone like. Sometimes folks has reported hearing those bells in the night before. It's actually a bit of a ghost story we tell around here sometimes. I looked up and I laughed. It's okay. I don't think there's anything spooky about it. I walked over to the village at Ashton and I saw the church. It was pretty old. "Ashton, did you say?" He looked puzzled. "Yes, I spoke to the old chap there, although he wasn't much help, to be honest. I finished in the hope that this local man might be able to shed more light on the matter. I passed the cash over, but the chap took it and held on to it." "Ashton, you mean you went there?" I nodded. "Yes." "You mean Ashton, the village beyond your cottage that was bombed in the war? There's nothing left now, only trees and stones. Your cottage was the last building, part of the village, the only one left standing after the bombing."